Okay, so thanks everybody for joining, and thank you very much, Marion, for agreeing to come present to us now. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you online, because I've admired your work for many years now. So for those of you who don't know, Marion is a biomechanist, but she's been sort of pushing the boundaries of what we know as biomechanics. And I think it's fair to say that Marion was applying machine learning to biomechanics before it was even cool. So she did her PhD at the German Sport University in Cologne, and now she's postdoc at University of West Australia. She's obviously going to take us through what her research involves, but essentially utilising machine learning, a bit of computer science within biomechanics. So it's very much aligned with what we're doing within camera. And I guess ultimately we have very similar goals in that we are trying to take biomechanics out of the lab, collect kind of relevant and valid data in the field of play outside of the lab. So without further ado, thank you very much again, Marion, for joining us. I really look forward to your talk.
Thanks, Steffi, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to present my research. I hope there are not too many people who have seen a very similar presentation at the ISBS conference last year. Yeah, I hope it's not going to be too boring for those who have. Anyway, to get started, so as Steffi said, my main aim is to take data collection and biomechanics out of the lab into the field by repurposing historical data sets and using them to train machine learning models. We all know machine learning, we all know AI, and we all know that it is part of our life, but how much is machine learning actually used in sports biomechanics? That was one question my PhD student and I asked us in 2021 when we started to have a systematic look into the literature and looking into pretty much everything that has been published using machine learning in sports biomechanics. And we all also know that AI is promising to revolutionize the world. Everything's going to change, and what does that mean for our field in biomechanics? Is machine learning or AI really changing things, or is it more over-promising? So what we found, and what is not surprising, in probably since 2017, there are more and more research articles published in the field of sports biomechanics. But how about the promise and reality? So we classified our articles into aligned and not aligned. What does that mean? So aligned means the aims that were stated are aligned with the outcome, while the non-aligned aims are mostly over-promising and do not really match the outcome. To give some examples, we found multiple classification papers, for example, of squatting technique into good and bad. And the whole aim of these studies was injury prevention. How does that work? If we just know whether we perform a good or a bad squat, it does not really tell us what we need to change to actually prevent injury. We also don't even know what is good and what is bad, just because an algorithm says, oh, this is good and that is bad. Another example of over-promising was a feedback tool that actually just recognizes a skill in a sequence of movement data. So by knowing that an athlete is performing a jump shot, I still don't know. So I can't provide any feedback on this skill. I can just say, okay, that's a jump shot. Or one of my favorite examples, actually one of my own publications, was the estimation of joint moments during sidestepping tasks in athletes free of injury. And I stated we can use this tool for injury prevention. So this is one of my first research outputs. And yeah, during the last couple of years, I think we have shifted more and more in this direction of, yeah, we can use machine learning and we can use it for injury prevention or performance enhancement, but actually what we suggest are more basic tools, more prototypes or pilot studies that in some years probably will be able to aid injury prevention or performance enhancement, but right now we are just not at this stage yet. And I think all the examples that I've shown here are in a similar category. So it's first steps towards the bigger aim, but we are still not there yet. Then what is more concerning are studies where I think research resources are wasted. For example, in basketball, I don't need a machine learning model to tell me that NBA players who score perform better and are more popular. That's a no-brainer. But even more harmful was one study that found that taller boys have a high risk of injury when they play soccer. So what does it mean for taller boys? Should we exclude them from any talent programs because of their high risk to injury? Do we really think that the height of the boys is the causation of the injury, or is it just a correlation that we found and we actually need to go back and try to analyze why these boys get injured and others are not? So this is probably the most negative part of machine learning that I want to talk about today. I just want to create a little bit of awareness and really encourage everyone to read articles very, very carefully, because we were really surprised how many aligned and how many non-aligned articles we could actually find. But then we also have really, really good applications of machine learning, and they also promise or don't overpromise. So when should we use, or which ones are those? One really good one was the classification of post-ACL injury athletes based on their sidestepping biomechanics into athletes that should return to play and others that shouldn't, which I think makes sense, doesn't overpromise. Then what you are mostly looking at and interested in, from my understanding of what my research on your group actually told me, is the estimation of motion kinematics from video data. So three-dimensional pose estimation for without any markers, without any sensors involved. And finally, the topic that I am most interested in is the estimation of motion kinetics based on motion kinematics to develop on-field tools. So this is what the remainder of my talk will be about. So how can we bring the lab to the field and estimate kinetic parameters from kinematic parameters that are easier to measure? And I will describe my research career so far as a lot of steep uphills and fast downhills, where actually things finally work and you can really make use of things you developed previously and repurpose everything. So in 2017, machine learning was not such a big thing, but we thought it's definitely an area that's interesting to look at. So I started to do my PhD in Germany at the German Sport University in conjunction with the Technical University in Aachen on the development of an on-field tool for motion analysis. At that point, we were looking into walking, but also sidestepping data. So this is probably the research output I had during my PhD. So I started in 2016 and finished in 2020, mainly focused on the use of inertial sensors. After I finished my PhD, I came to Australia, joined Jackie Alderson's group at the University of Western Australia, and did just a little bit more work on inertial sensors, but then quickly moved towards video data. and how we can use video data instead of inertial sensor data. Different inputs, but still very similar methods involved here. So I could leverage a lot of the skills I actually acquired during my PhD. Yeah, so this is probably the part that I want to talk about today, and then hopefully move on this year with finally publishing our systematic review we started in 2021, and also talking, getting more into the applied direction, working more with the Australian Institute of Sport to support the high performance sport with our machine learning applications. Okay. To go a little bit back in history, in 2017, we started to look into machine learning and inertial sensors in gait analysis. So it was not really cool at that time. It was really hard to get machine learning applications published because it was just so new. So we started with a systematic review and looked into the use of inertial sensors and machine learning in gait analysis. And we found that there are a couple of applications that detected gait phases or spatial temporal parameters for clustering applications. But what we were actually interested in were joint angles and joint moments or ground reaction forces, so kinematic and kinetic parameters. And hardly any publication could be found at that time. So actually great for us. So we found the research gap, and that's where we wanted to move forward to. But first, I needed to learn what inertial sensors actually can do and what they can't do. So we wanted to figure out what's the difference between joint angles that can be determined with optical motion capture data. So that's the historic and gold standard way to do it. And what's the difference to do it with inertial sensors? So there were a couple of systems on the market that allowed you to directly output the joint angles based on inertial sensors. And we looked into one of these systems and found quite big differences between the inertial sensor joint angles and the optical motion capture joint angles. And we thought, okay, this might be caused by either the technology itself that does not offer the enough accuracy, enough precision to actually estimate or determine joint angles, or it's based on the anatomical model that's part of the inertial sensor, but also part of the optical motion capture system. So we used the same anatomical model and decreased the error between both systems drastically. So we could actually say the main difference is in the anatomical model. So the technology of inertial sensors is capable of determining joint angles. Also a good finding for us to move forward and work with inertial sensors. And for that purpose, we wanted to develop a machine learning framework for motion analysis based on inertial sensors. So we have probably 4 questions we always need to answer when we create such a framework. The first one, what's actually the application that we want to look at? Which measurement system can I use for this particular application? Do I already have a data set? Do I need to collect data? And how should this data set look like? Which size of a data set is necessary? And probably the final question is, which machine learning algorithm can I use? Or do I really need a machine learning algorithm at all for the question that I'm trying to answer? So this is pretty much the circle that I try to walk around again and again during my PhD. So the first question we asked was, what kinematic input parameters do I need to train an artificial neural network to estimate motion kinetics? And at that point, we did not have any inertial sensor data, so we started with optical motion capture data. And we had different inputs. We used the full body marker set, a lower body marker set, and joint angles to estimate joint moments and ground reaction force. And we found that the difference for the estimation of joint moments based on all three different inputs was very similar, but for the ground reaction force, the error increased using joint angles compared to marker trajectories of the full body or lower body marker set. However, the difference between full body and lower body was very, very small. So what we found is that the information of the lower body movement is sufficient to estimate joint moments for hip, knee, and ankle joint. Based on marker trajectories. The next question we asked was, how much variability do I need in my data set? So is it better to look at just a single motion, so one step, or is it better to combine different movements so that the variability is bigger and the data set is also bigger? For that purpose, we looked into the execution antipart contact of sidestepping tasks and the combination of both. And we found, again, for joint moments, that the estimation was slightly lower when using the combined data set, but we had a better estimation of the ground reaction force when using the combined data set. Although the differences were small, we think the larger variability might help in the long run. So probably by including even more steps of the run-up before and after the actual sidestep might help. As a next step, we were looking into using different algorithms. So a dense neural network is pretty much the simplest neural network we can find, but recurrent neural networks could be favorable because they can be applied in real time. They need less pre-processing of the data. So that would be long-term a better solution for a tool that can be applied on field. So we compared a dense neural network and a recurrent neural network for the estimation of motion kinetics, again, using optical motion capture data. And we found that the MLP, or dense neural network, performed better than an LSTM, which is a recurrent neural network, with a difference of about 30%, which is quite distinct, but we did not want to give up at this point. So MLPs are more accurate, but they are so much less versatile that we are still looking into using LSTMs. And also, this was in 2019, so the last 4 years are, quite a long time, and things have changed. So probably these results can be improved by now. We still, in 2020, did not have any good data sets that contained inertial sensor data. So what we tried was to synthesize inertial sensor data using motion capture data, and then train an MLP and an LSTM neural network to see whether it's actually feasible to use inertial sensor input, so acceleration and angular rate, for the estimation of joint kinematics and kinetics. The idea was, if we can estimate the joint kinematics instead of using joint angles directly, we avoid the problem of the different anatomical models. So that was our next aim. And we found that both neural networks can actually predict joint moments and joint angles quite well for walking, at least, and for synthesized data. And again, the MLP slightly outperformed the LSTM neural network. However, the difference between joint angles and inertial sensor data was smaller than 15%, which was promising and actually showed us that we wanted to keep moving into the direction of using inertial sensor data. So we developed our own small inertial sensor-based motion analysis system, which contained 5 sensors. And we used that to validate our findings on the synthetic IMU data. And we wanted to look further and see whether we can train a neural network on synthetic inertial sensor data and estimate the joint angles and moments from real inertial sensors. So first, we had to validate the synthetic data and got correlation coefficients of higher than 0.8. So we said for our purpose, the synthetic data is valid. So it's similar enough to the actual measured data so that we think it will help to train a neural network by just enlarging the data set that we have. And we found that this hypothesis is true. So we just had about 1,800 samples of measured joint moments and 3,100 samples of measured only joint angles, but way more synthetic and measured data, and found an improvement in the estimation. Although again, the difference is quite small. So there will probably be, I think the major issue is the limited variability in our walking data set. And that's why the increase in numbers does not improve the estimation as much as it could. We further found a 5% improvement to using just synthesized IMU data as inputs for the estimation of joint moments, but the estimation of joint angles was way worse using measured data instead of just synthetic data. We think this is mainly caused by noise that we can't find in the synthetic data, but in the measured data that somehow confuses the estimation of joint angles, but impacts it way more than the joint moments. So as a takeaway, we can say synthetic data worked really well for the estimation of joint moments, but not for the joint angles. The next question we try to answer is how many input parameters are actually necessary to estimate joint angles and moments. So for this purpose, we had our 5 sensors performed a PCA on it, so reduced the number of input parameters to, I think it was 5 principal components that actually covered 95% of the variance in the data. We had the 5 sensors, so acceleration and angular rate as input data, and then we physically reduced the data set to 3 sensors on pelvis and thighs, 3 sensors, which is pelvis and shanks, and just 1 sensor that was based on the, located on the pelvis. And the difference between using 5 physical sensors and 3 sensors was actually really, really small, with 3 sensors located in pelvis and shanks performing best. But we found nearly 30% difference when using just a single sensor, which is not unexpected, but still it's quite a good finding for us because 1 sensor is so much easier to use than 5 sensors or even 3 sensors. So it's always probably dependent on the application that I'm looking at, whether I want to have a higher or whether I need a higher accuracy, or whether I'm okay having a really simple setup with a single sensor and accepting my lower accuracy. Surprisingly, the PCA did not perform well at all. As a takeaway, we can say pelvis and shank sensors are sufficient for the estimation of joint angles. Yeah, so when I joined the research group in Australia, they were mainly using convolutional neural networks, something I've never done before, and they had better results than what I achieved using inertial sensor data. So what we wanted to do is to compare the 3 algorithms we have and the 3 methods we used on the same data set. So for this purpose, we used my inertial sensor data set containing synthetic and measured inertial sensor data to estimate joint moments and joint angles. We trained an MLP neural network, an LSTM neural network, and a convolutional neural network, and also used a pre-trained convolutional neural network, which was the standard way to do it in the group in Australia. And we found that similar to all the previous findings, MLP and LSTM network performed similarly, but LSTM is slightly worse. The CNN was nearly 10% better than the MLP. So the methodology used here worked better. And the difference between a pre-trained and a CNN that's trained from scratch was very small. So yeah, what does this mean for us? So an MLP is probably still the simplest way to estimate joint angles, can't be used in real time, but is not that hard to train. So might be a good option to start with. An LSTM needs way less pre-processing, so might be worthwhile to accept the 3% differences in accuracy here for the limited pre-processing I need. And the CNN performs much better, but we had to create images of all our movement data, so a lot of pre-processing needed to actually make this work. So which algorithm to use absolutely depends on the application and depends on what I want to achieve and how much pre-processing I'm actually willing to do. Now I want to move towards the video data. And similar to my problem when I started working with inertial sensors, there are also not a lot of large 2D video data sets that contain kinetic information. So that is collected with both optical motion capture data, force plates, and video cameras. So what we have is a lot of 3D motion capture data. And the idea was, how can we use that to enlarge or even create new 2D video data sets? And we used animation software for this task. So one of my master students did her master's thesis on this and animated motion capture trials. Yeah, our motion capture data did not have arms. That's why they are always in this T position and don't move. But that actually does not influence any of our outputs because the rest of the body is driven by the motion capture data. So this is what our animations looked like compared to the actual video data that we have. And it looks quite similar. And it also showed to be very similar. So the differences in key points estimated in the animation data compared with the key points estimated in real video data was smaller than 3.5 millimeters. So the error was really, really small, and we accepted that as sufficient to use the synthetic data to train machine learning models. We then asked us the question whether we could use the same methodology for a more complex task, such as long jump. So we have a long jump data set from the German Sport University that does not contain any real video data. But if we look into long jump, we want to be able to analyze training videos or competition videos with that. And can we actually use one of the really high quality motion capture data sets of elite long jump to support this? And yeah, so that's what we were looking at. And the next step was also how accurate or how important is the accuracy of the body shape that I actually animate. So we used 4 different hulls, one really big one, then the standard human, like standard male person, the 50th percentile, and the in yellow is actually our long jumpers anthropometry that was determined, and we could not find any difference in the key points estimated dependent on the body shape, which is quite promising because that means a lot less work. So if we use a body shape that's similar but not the same, we can actually use the standard one for any athlete. Unfortunately, our data set is so small, it just contains 5 long jumpers that we can't really use it for the estimation of kinetic information yet. So this was the first work I have done towards synthesizing video data, and then we wanted to know whether we can actually use the key points that we estimate in this data to estimate ground reaction force. We used synthetic data and real data and could find hardly any difference between both, which is great. So synthetic data can be used to train an artificial neural network and can help us and support the creation of larger data sets for machine learning applications. To create this synthetic data is actually quite computationally expensive, and also it's quite automated, but there are some steps that still need to be undertaken manually. So we were looking into a more efficient method to actually repurpose motion capture data sets. So the idea was, if we can calculate the key points, so we can actually calculate the key points in or joint centers in 3D and just project them to 2D. So can we then use that as input for our neural networks? So on the left, we can see how the movement looks like in 3D. And on the right, we've projected the same movement to 2D. This way, we can also create a lot of different camera views from wherever we want, whatever distance, whatever height, whatever angle. So we can augment one trial to nearly, to whatever number of augmented trials we want to. The question we need to ask here is just how much data augmentation is actually useful. We haven't investigated that, so that's still one thing to do. In our last publication, we were actually thinking of using different off-the-shelf pose estimation models because they all have their advantages and disadvantages. And we wanted to see if there's one that's particularly better to be used to estimate ground reaction force than another one. And we looked into alpha pose, blaze pose, and open pose, and found alpha pose and open pose to perform relatively similar, apart from the mediolateral direction, and Blaise pose was always a fair bit off. So in this case, our conclusion was that alpha pose is probably the best one to use here, but that's probably also one thing that you have been looking at previously and might even have the better models than this. And what we were also interested in is what if one research group has a data set and estimated key points using alpha pose, and another research group has another data set but is using open pose. Can I actually use different key points interchangeably if I train my model just on those key points that are detected by all different algorithms? And we found that alpha pose and open pose can be used interchangeably, but we found significant differences between Blaise pose and the other two. So Blaise pose key points cannot be used if I use Blaise pose key points in a model that has been trained on alpha pose key points, I will get distinctly different results. So that's probably one thing to take away. So we found alpha pose and open pose to be definitely better than Blaise pose. Right, and that's probably where my journey ends so far. So more to come, hopefully in 2023. Really looking forward to that. Thanks to the team around me, so all the people in Germany and in Australia that have supported this work. Thanks again for the opportunity to present here, and happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Marion. That was a really clear overview of how you've approached these tricky problems and how kind of this has evolved over time as the knowledge around these algorithms has evolved. Does anybody have any questions for Marion? I can't see everybody. If you do, please unmute.
I think Neil might have his hand up.
Sorry, I'm trying to find the hand thing and I forgot where the hand thing is out of Zoom practice. But thank you, Matt. This is very, very interesting. And my background is more from the machine learning and not so much from sports science. But I had a question about some of the really interesting graphs you were showing when you were comparing different architectural models. So the MLP versus convolutional neural networks and things like that, or LSTMs. I just wondered what was the process for going about deciding the specific architectures to represent? I mean, obviously, there's a massive class of models, each of those. So how did you choose to make comparable architectures if you're comparing, say, an MLP with an LSTM or something like that?
Yeah, in our first couple of articles where we did that, we really tried it more or less manually. So I did a grid search manually, started with having, I think, 1 to 5 hidden layers, like check which one performs best, and then used the best performing architecture to try different numbers of neurons, tried different dropout values. Mm-hmm. So that was really a lot of manual work. And later on, in our framework, we had an automated grid search. So that took time, but we would do a similar thing, like automatically training different models on different layer sizes, different numbers of layers, different activation functions. So we just automated all of that. Which made it way quicker.
Cool, brilliant, thank you.
Does anybody else have a question? I have quite a few.
I have a couple, Steffi. Yeah. Hi, Marion, and nice to meet you
Hey.
online. Yeah, how are you doing? So yeah, Neil stole one of my questions, because that's one aspect that in some of our project now we are, fighting with. So there's certainly elements that you can optimize, for example, through hyperparameter optimization, but there's always an element of executive decisions when it comes to choosing the architecture. So I'll move perhaps towards more biomechanics questions. In reality, when you do all the comparison between, the ground truth and, the estimation from either wearables or from video and so on, I wonder whether there's an element in the quality of the outcomes that is caused by the fact that in reality there's no ground truth, because even the gold standard that we use, which is motion capture, sometimes might be affected by relatively high noise, especially in the secondary plane of motion. So I wonder whether perhaps the performance of your algorithm may not be as good, but just because the gold standard might not be as accurate as we think. And the second one is, going back to perhaps your first studies in relation to the wearables, the use of, machine learning from, data that comes from wearable. I've seen that you've done, some study on which combination of wearables is best, but I guess that starts from, a certain setup that you chose, to begin with in your protocol. I wonder whether you think that actually the choice of where the wearable goes has also a big impact in the quality of the algorithm, because in most of the studies I've seen in the literature, many wearables are located where a biomechanist would put them, but in the real world, those won't be the positions where consumer-based technologies will eventually be. So yeah, just a reflection on those two elements.
Yeah. So one comment on the first question or comment. Yeah, definitely. Our results can only be as good as our data we use for training, right? So if we say if our ground truth data is not accurate, we definitely don't get an accurate result. But I think we just have to accept that, and we can't change it. We need to be aware of that. But this just holds true for all motion analysis papers or research in general. Secondary motion planes are difficult. Yeah. And the second comment, I think what would be really interesting actually is to simulate inertial sensors and just place them wherever randomly and see what works best. So I think just that's definitely something to play with. And I mean, we have the computational power to do that, and we have the methods to do that. So I reckon that would be a good study, and also like creating different noise in the inertial sensor data would definitely have an impact. So do I wear my watch like really tight around my wrist, or is it loosely, so that I have actually way more noise in there? I think that's all stuff that we can simulate and that we should simulate, just because it's so much more efficient than like performing trials. Surely we need to validate it, but yeah, I think that's would be interesting to really do a larger simulation study on that.
Great, let's do it.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thanks you very much.
Pleasure.
Any other questions, Marion? I can go. Yeah, so I think a number of times, Marion, you spoke about how you think that the variability in your training data set might be limiting you to in some extent. Do you have any grasp of how well some of your models would apply to a completely different population, like clinical populations? Have you looked at any extrapolating beyond your training population?
Yeah, so my walking data set contained healthy participants and people with osteoarthritis. So it worked surprisingly well. but I think also those people still did not work that much differently. So it would definitely be interesting to check that more extensively. So really have different walking impairments and check how the models perform, and also see whether it makes a difference to have some, let's say, impaired participants included in the training data set, if that really makes a difference or not. So yeah. Yeah, I think as long as it's a mild impairment, it still works. But I assume as soon as we probably go into neurological diseases, it's not going to work.
Makes sense. Thank you very much for that answer. I have one more about, it's on the same lines as the question that Ezio had about a marker-based being our gold standard, and this is something that we wrestle with ourselves as well, with our comparisons against marker-based our markerless frameworks. I was thinking about when you're using it or when it's used as an input to synthetic data sets, and whether there's anything that we can do to sort of minimize the effect of soft tissue artifact in the data that's then being used to drive the synthetic data. Well, there's anything that you think we could do going forwards to reduce that effect?
Not on top of my head. Yeah, don't know. I think that's very difficult.
Yeah. Well, how much of a problem is it, I guess, is my question. How much of a problem do you see that being present in a synthetic data set driven by marker-based data?
I think what really helps is, or what would probably really help, is to create more noise. So to create more noise to actually really train the model on a larger variability. So I think that would help. How much of a problem it is I think it's very hard to quantify that, because we just don't know any better, right? So we just know, or we just assume that our ground truth data is ground truth data. We assume that this is as good as it gets. So I mean, it's in the data that we train on, it's in the data that we test on, so it should actually not really affect the accuracy of the models. But it might just be that we don't have the real value, right?
We'll just all continue to blindly use it and all agree that's all right then for now.
Yeah.
Okay,
yes, I think it's impossible to say what is right. Like what is the correct value? We just don't know.
Yeah, Dario is saying dynamic X-ray is the answer. Yeah, if we're just interested in just the ankle joint, maybe.
That's a tough one, eh?
Yeah. Mark, I believe you have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Steffi, and thanks everyone in Bath for letting me jump in today, and thanks to Marion for the presentation. Exactly picking up the point was actually the question that I had too. Obviously, validation is going to be important, over the next few years. It seems to be everyone's running these different types of validation studies, and exactly the point that Steffi and Ezio made is something we've all been thinking about, I suppose. And so the approach that I was trying to move towards was whether we can create, for example, avatars with known kinematics. And when I say known kinematics, I mean prescribed kinematics that we give the avatar mathematically or through constraints that we allow the avatar to have. And in my mind, that seems a better way, or at least a more confident way that I would have in trying to compare markerless and marker-based solutions too. And obviously the multiple camera views that you had could then perhaps nicely feed back into calibration protocols. Ultimately, you could generate the the 2D views that all of the cameras are seeing in your particular markerless setup. And I wonder if something like that could be possible. Obviously, I don't know how exactly you'd create those avatar-based kinematics, but that's kind of the approach that I was thinking about, rather than trying to compare just markers to markerless, because as we all know, there's issues with that. And so I was trying to kind of search for a better ground truth, and that was where I was. So anyone who has any thoughts about how we could, for example, create ground truth through avatars that we prescribe the kinematics of. And Marion, it seems that you're the closest person to doing this at the moment. So I was kind of hoping that you might have a sense of that.
Yeah, so that's exactly our thought, because it is just, but it is not easy to create these avatars. At least we haven't found a solution for this yet. But that's exactly what we were thinking of as well. So we need to have we need to have a really known movement trajectory to really validate the inputs, or the outputs, and and even the comparison of different pose estimators. We don't know which one is correcter, if that exists. So
but I guess fundamentally under the hood of these things, we could, I'm thinking of like the kinematics from an OpenSim model, which is constrained in certain locations, and then fitting flesh around it, or your hull, or whatever you might call it, and then fundamentally under the hull you have the kinematics, which because you prescribe them.
If OpenSim offers that, would be great. No, I haven't used OpenSim a lot.
No, I mean, me neither. So I'm sure other people will know.
But it's exactly our thought process.
Just whilst we're on this topic, can I just throw a comment? And I think because we've had a big discussion about generating synthetic data for training or specializing the ability to run our pose detectors and to get the best pose that we might be able to get. I think there's lots of subtle problems that you won't notice along the way, but you have to start with a model that lets you represent what's real, but you also have to have realistic motion. And there's interesting subtleties about if you fit that model, say you took the simple model, which we know doesn't have really realistic joint centers, and you fit that to motion capture data, and then you somehow put bodies and nice animations around that, and you render it into a lovely scene. You then have the interesting thing that that simple doesn't bend around real joint centers that are biologically accurate. So if you get the model right, such that it has real biological joints and things, then a really good ground truth, and you can render that in lots of different ways. It's not hard to render a picture these days that looks real enough to test things like open pose or dense pose or all the rest of them on. So in a way, the key part of generating the synthetic data is getting a model that will let you know the ground truth, but that ground truth actually is representative of a real human, perhaps. Or at least that's my big worry about generating synthetic data is it's easy to render something, and it's easy to fit a model to motion capture data, but that model still has to somehow be realistic to a real human, and otherwise you might induce some curious subtleties that you don't necessarily want or didn't think of.
I think that's the major challenge for the next probably years. I mean, so in computer vision, people are quite happy with having something that's similar enough. But I think in biomechanics, it's just not the case. So we are looking for way more accuracy, and that's where it becomes very difficult. So as you said, having something that looks real enough is doable, but something that's really real is very difficult.
I think OpenSim was mentioned, so Dario's got a question.
Yeah, I think Etienne was before me, but
Oh, sorry.
but yeah, Etienne, did you want to say something about this, or?
No, I think it's been covered to an extent. Yeah, I was, you know, practically saying the same things that Mari wanted to, you know, or added, but Mari has said it in a better way than myself. Yeah, I just wanted to say that when, especially, you know, Marion mentioned, you know, adding variability and adding noise, I guess the main issue is modeling that noise and that variability in a way that is representative of the humans, and not just a nice replica, but, you know, something that's real and can train the model. The only other note is about, you know, we've been talking about methods that may work for when the cameras are available. There might be a situation, especially if you want to go to the field, where you can't use cameras. So probably, you know, having, you know, think of a wearable or alternatives is still probably a need that needs to be explored.
Yeah, I think there's space for both. I think you can't say either inertial sensors are the thing to do or videos the thing to do. I think both can be used in different settings.
Or together at some in some cases, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we don't have much time. I just want to, you know, I think I agree with Mark. I like the idea, and I've been thinking about the same. And I do believe if you got a validated model, especially for the spine, or especially if you're doing, you know, if you're validating it for injury prevention perspective, because this kind of data are very difficult to measure in the real world, you could use model and really further our understanding of that. The problem with using the model is, as you said, is the variability. So you can add noise to the model. You can have the stochastic approach added on top of the musculoskeletal modeling, and therefore that will give you variability. But maybe that's an open question. My worry was mainly on the rendering of it. So if I use OpenSim to get the you know, the key points of the joint center, whatever it is, then when I render it in, you know, how is real the rendering? Maybe the rendering is not a problem, but, you know, how, you know, if you want to compare the soft, you know, replicate the soft tissue motion, you want to replicate the clothing motion, you want to replicate this kind of effects. If you don't do that well in the rendering, then you are going to train and CNN or other type of networks not in the right way, because they're not going to see the same things, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's the major challenge we are facing at the moment, right? So I think we can. The problem is to get a hull or body shape or whatever we call it that is really moving correctly with the joint centers that we know that we can calculate. So yeah, I think that's the major challenge, and so I find it really interesting to try and talk to computer vision specialists about that, because they are always like, oh yeah, but that looks all right. That looks all right. That's good enough. And I find it really hard to convince them that good enough is a different standard in biomechanics. So
and maybe we're wrong though. I don't know. Maybe good enough. I don't know. We should try.
I guess so. I think that's exactly the challenge we face at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. So simulation is good. I wanted to say just that.
Yeah,
I thought that's why you're popping by. We're going to have to leave it there. I think we could probably all discuss this topic for hours. Thank you everyone for contributing to that discussion. Thank you again, Marion, for a very thought-provoking talk, and I'm sure we'll continue to have many discussions over the coming years on this topic. So yeah, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thank you.